All right. Right. Can someone give me a signal? Should I just start?
Hi, Roger.
Hey, Ahmad, how are you?
All right, thank you very much. You can upload your file if you have, and you
Okay.
can start it.
Okay, good.
No
That's
problem.
fine. Okay, I'll start now. Can you let me know if you can see that?
Yes, it's good.
Good. Okay, just let me close my door and I'll start now. Right. Okay, good morning, everyone. Sorry we're a few minutes late. I had some technical problems getting in, but we're okay now. I hope that everyone can see the slides, and I hope that everyone can hear me and also can understand me. I will try to speak not too quickly. I'm living and working in the UK, so I'm speaking to you today from a city called Hull in England. And my name's Roger Watson, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Nurse Education in Practice. I've been with this journal since January, and prior to that, I edited the Journal of Advanced Nursing, and prior to that, I edited the Journal of Clinical Nursing. So I'm going to talk for probably around about an hour today. I think we have something like 90 minutes altogether, and I'm happy at the end to take some questions, either verbally or people can type them in the chat. And if there isn't time to take questions at the end, or if you need to ask me any more, on the final PowerPoint, my email address is there, and you're welcome to contact me after the session. And you're also quite welcome to have the PowerPoints if anybody wants them. I can send them to you, or my colleagues in Tehran can send them to you. So I'll start, and what I want to talk about really is the publication process, and I'm going to break this down into what happens to your manuscript. Understanding the impact factor, I thought I would mention something about the impact factor because it's important to editors and it's important to journals, and it is actually quite important to many authors. I will look briefly at the peer review process, and then I'm going to cover two aspects of what are called the Equator guidelines. And finally, I want to finish on some points about the ethics of publication and authorship. And what I want to do today is to explain some aspects of the publication process, which some of you may already know about, some of you may not, but what I want to do is to try to help you to understand it in a way that should help you to get published. I can't guarantee that you'll get published anywhere or that any particular journal will take your manuscript, but I think if you are aware of some of the things that happen to your manuscript and what we are looking for, then it should help you and should increase your chances of getting published. And I know how important getting published is to people in clinical practice and in academia across the whole world these days. So this cartoon kind of explains what it feels like to be an author submitting your manuscript to a journal. And I'm exactly the same as you. I may be an editor, but I'm also an academic. I do research and I have to publish. So I'm frequently the person who is submitting a manuscript. So I share these concerns with you. But today I'm speaking to you more as an editor. And what you're trying to do is to get your manuscript from the bottom left side of this cartoon up to the top right-hand side, and to have your paper accepted. And I know very well what it feels like. It feels that at several steps along the way, there are people who are trying to stop you from getting published. That's what it feels like. It isn't actually like, that isn't actually what it's meant to be like. These people are actually meant to be helpful and to help you to get published, but we also have to be very aware of the quality of what we're publishing. So not every manuscript gets accepted. Very few manuscripts are accepted without some revisions. That almost never happens. And the various people that lie along your path to getting published are people like me, the editor-in-chief, and the editors-in-chief are people who essentially decide what the content of the journal will be. They're the ones who see your paper at the beginning of the process and decide whether your paper, your manuscript, is going to be put forward to other editors. So after the editor-in-chief, you'll have a team of editors. One of them will have a look at your article. They can also decide whether it's acceptable or not. That can be another seeming barrier. After the editor come the reviewers, the peer reviewers. They can also seem like they're trying to get in the way. And then finally, there'll be someone taking a decision at the end of the process, usually the editor-in-chief again. And even when that's done, you're not finished. You still have to correct the proof and correct the manuscript and make sure everything's right. So it's not a quick process. It's never quick. It takes time, and it's not something that gives you very quick rewards. It's always many steps, and it isn't always successful. So sorry, it's a little bit obscured at the top on my view here, but this is essentially the process that a manuscript goes through. Don't expect you to remember all this. It's a little bit detailed, but if you start at the top left of the screen, the box there that's slightly obscured on my view here that's you submitting your manuscript to the journal, and then it goes initially, in my particular journal, it goes to an administrative agent, who is essentially someone who works for the publishing company, and they will check the manuscript to see if it meets the basic requirements. These are the basic, very simple requirements. Is it the right length? If it's a review paper, does it have the correct diagrams and correct checklists in there? Is the referencing system done properly? And is the abstract, for example, is that formatted correctly? So if it's not done correctly at that process, it will be sent back to the author by the administrative assistant, and they will indicate what's wrong with the manuscript and ask you to correct it. And once they're happy that the manuscript is in the correct format, it doesn't have any viruses in the files, it's not too similar to other sources, because we run all our manuscripts through similarity checking, then it will be assigned to the editor-in-chief in my journal, or to the deputy editor-in-chief. We have two strands of papers in the journal, one about nursing and one about midwifery. But so the midwifery papers go to the deputy editor-in-chief, who is a midwife. But most of the papers, the vast majority, come to me as editor-in-chief. And I think it's important to note at this point, at this level, you can be desk rejected. And desk rejected means that the manuscript is not sent forward to an editor. It's considered not to be suitable for the journal, And I would say that more than half of the manuscripts that come into my journal and to my previous journal are rejected at this point. And one of the major reasons for rejection, and something that the administrative assistant wouldn't be able to pick up, but one of the major reasons is that the article is outside of the scope of the journal. I mean, this morning I rejected 2 papers on that basis. Yesterday morning, I think I rejected 4 or 5 articles on that basis. So it's clear that people haven't read the guidelines for the journal. I will come back to these later. So my journal, for example, my present journal is an education journal. So we don't take purely clinical papers. So if it's outside of the scope of the journal, then we will send it back. Otherwise, we're looking for articles that are interesting, original, well written, and which fit the scope of the journal. But mostly, we are looking for articles that are likely in the end to be accepted, because we don't want to, we get hundreds, if not thousands of articles every year, and we don't want to waste the time of editors and reviewers and our systems working with manuscripts which we think are not going to be accepted. So we make a very quick decision, usually within 24 hours, about whether your manuscript should go forward or not. That shouldn't prevent you from sending the manuscript somewhere else. You may be given some idea as to why it's been rejected, but usually with desk rejections, we don't give you any specific reason. We give you a general reason, and we don't usually enter into correspondence about it, or we would spend a lot of time corresponding about the desk rejections, because they are the majority of the manuscripts. So if a paper is suitable, then it will go to an editor. And while it's not entirely accurate here, the editors can actually reject it before they send it out to reviewers. So the diagram isn't exactly accurate, but the usual process is that the editors will send the paper to reviewers, and these reviewers will be experts in their field. We will come back to the reviewers later. The reviews will be returned, and the editor will make his or her mind up about whether the paper should be rejected, and the author is given reasons, and they can use those reasons to improve the paper and submit it to another journal, or hopefully you will be asked to revise your paper, and it will go through that process once again. And we try very hard only to make papers go through this system once. If papers are going to go through time and time again, we tend to reject them. Authors are expected to improve the paper with the guidance of the editors and the reviewers, and to get it right on the first occasion. If the author has satisfied the editors and the reviewers, then the paper moves up to the top right, to the green box, where the paper is given an accept decision by the editor, and then the editor-in-chief, myself in this case, for all the manuscripts coming to the journal, will make the final decision. And 99% of the time that decision is yes. I very rarely reject manuscripts at this stage. I trust the editors and the reviewers to put through manuscripts which are good. And I don't just inform the author at that stage, I also give the article a final edit at that stage. I make sure that's in the format that I want it to be in for production. And I do check it, I do read it, I do make corrections, and sometimes I will ask the authors to give me further information before I finally move the paper on to production. I'm not going to talk about production because that's outside of the editorial process. That's between you and the editorial assistants. I don't see the manuscript again, and in fact, I don't see the proofs for correction in this system. So you have to make sure that you read your proofs very carefully and make sure that they are correct before the article is published, because that's the last opportunity that you'll have to do that. So as you can see, there are a great many steps in the process, and the more you understand these, I think the more that you are able to address the concerns of editors and reviewers and have your paper accepted and hopefully not, as I'm showing here, hopefully not rejected at these points. So I'm going to pick up on one or two aspects of this as we move on through the presentation. So one of the best things that you can do in understanding the publishing process is understanding that that you really should be writing first of all for the editors of the journal. I know this sounds a bit strange because you are writing ultimately to have your paper published and shared with a wide audience. If it's published, it's available to everyone. But really, you need to think about what the editors want at the beginning of the process. If you don't satisfy the editor-in-chief that your paper is within the scope of the journal and that it's original and it's worth publishing, then you will not get onto the next part of the process, which is the reviewers. So you also need to think then about reviewers. And of course, you have to think about the reviewers if you're revising your paper, but you also have to think about the reviewers at the beginning of the process and assume that your reviewers will be experts. They may be clinical experts or educational experts, or they may be methodological experts. But you need to write your paper in the knowledge and the expectation that it will be read by an expert. One of the most common comments that I remember when I was an editor, before I was an editor-in-chief, from reviewers, when I dealt with reviews, was the reviewers would say, "I do not understand what the author has done here." So the whole process needs to be transparent. You need to write clearly. You need to explain exactly what you've done. And if you do that, then you stand a very good chance of getting through to the next process, which is having it published and having it sent out to a wider audience. So this is, I'm not, by the way, advertising my own journal here. I'm using my journal as an example of a typical journal, but I can only talk from the experience of my own journal. So one of the things to note about all journals, first of all journals are online these days. I don't think that there are any that are not available online, and in fact, a great many journals are only available online. The thing that you should really be looking for, apart from the aims and objectives of the journal, you should be checking the guide for authors before you submit an article. I think one of the best pieces of advice I can give any author, whether they're experienced or not so experienced, is that you should always have a journal in your mind when you are writing your manuscript. In other words, check the guidance, find out what the journal requires, and then write to those requirements. Of course, if your paper is rejected, you then need to think of another journal and you need to check the guidance again and write for that. But don't do what some people do, which is writing a very general manuscript and then looking for a journal to fit it into, because you will inevitably have to do a great deal of rewriting in the process. So try and aim for a specific journal at the beginning. And most sensible authors have a plan A, which is the journal that they most want to get into, but you should also have a plan B and possibly a plan C. You should know if your article is rejected immediately where you would want to send it. For example, if an article is rejected by Nurse Education and Practice, it may be appropriate to send it to Nurse Education Today, or the other way around. If they reject it, then it might be possible to send it to Journal of Advanced Nursing, which also takes educational articles. But have some plan in mind for the where you want to send it. I'm using nursing journals as examples. I know that the audience is not all nurses, but you'll have your own journals in mind. But never only don't just have one journal in mind. And if you do get rejected, don't give up. Always make a rejection the beginning of the next submission. So if you're rejected, just say to yourself and your colleagues who you're writing with, where is it going to go next? And you can download the guidance for authors, but you can also check it online by clicking on all of these headings here. And every journal I know has a similar kind of system. But I would urge you, if you checked the guidance for a journal 6 months ago and you're coming back to that journal with another manuscript, please check the guidance again, because the guidance is constantly updated. I've only been with nurse education and practice since January, so I haven't even been with it for 6 months yet. And we have radically changed the guidance for authors, and then we've updated that on almost a weekly basis, mostly when we see that something else that needs to be added, or authors point out to us something that's not clear or that's wrong. But it does settle down a bit after a while, but we are constantly updating. And in a year's time, we'll probably revise them again. The whole world of academic publishing keeps changing. Standards get more copious and more strict. So we have to make sure that we are adhering to those standards and that you are aware what those standards are. So I'll say it several times in this talk: check the guidance for authors, and that really is what you need to use as a template for whichever type of article you're submitting. So I just want to look briefly at the changing subject for a few minutes, look briefly at the impact factor, something that you may already know about, but I just thought that I would make sure that I clarified with you what the impact factor was. There are several measures of journal performance. You'll notice that my journal, for example, being an Elsevier journal, uses a site score. There are eigenvalues and Shimago ratings, but the impact factor, which is owned by Clarivate, is the one that everyone really refers to. I'm not trying to defend the impact factor. It's very, very imperfect, very crude, but at least if you understand it, and certainly as an editor and perhaps as an author, you can make it useful for you. You can, and I'll tell you how in a minute. So the impact factor is a very strange number that was derived in the 1960s or maybe 70s by someone called Eugene Garfield, and it is completely arbitrary. And it wasn't intended initially to rank journals. It was intended initially to help librarians to know which journals were being cited and which ones they should purchase. And the way the citations are worked out is shown in the diagram. The impact factor for any particular year refers to citations in that year to articles published in the previous 2 years. So you add up the citations in that year and divide it by the number of articles published in the previous 2 years, and that gives you the impact factor. It's a simple ratio, and the anomalous thing, which is very strange, is that an article published in 2006 and cited in 2006 does not add to the impact factor. You have to wait till 2007 before they begin to count, or whichever year. We're now in 2021, so that tells you how old this slide is. So that's basically the impact factor. Not every type of article counts towards the impact factor, of course, mainly the research articles and reviews that are counted. But it's simply a measure of citations versus the number of papers published, and the more citations you get and the fewer papers that are published, or the bigger that ratio, the bigger the impact factor. So how is that important to authors? Well, I'm so sorry, I've done something wrong. That's it. It's important to authors because if you understand which papers editors like, then you can write those sorts of papers, not all the time, but at least you can know which papers are more likely to be published. And it's quite simple. The papers that contribute most to the impact factor, and this is true of any journal in any field, are review papers. And we get a great many of these into the journal, by which I mean maybe 10% of the content, but as a specific group of papers, we do get many of them. Now, as an editor, I know that these tend to help our impact factor, and I will almost always put these forward to an editor, and the editors will usually treat them favorably because we know that they are useful to postgraduate students, they're useful to other researchers, but they also help us to increase our citations and therefore our impact factor. We're allowed to do that. That's not against the rules. The next kinds of papers that are always highly cited, but we get very few of these, are methodological papers. In other words, papers that are not about a subject or a bit of research, but about developing a method, statistical methods, qualitative methods, anything that will help other people to do their research. And again, these are very popular with postgraduate students and with other researchers. And then original research, of which 90% of the papers probably or more are original research. This is the work that you and I as everyday researchers get funding for, and we do. We conduct it, we employ people to help us, and then we publish it. But individual original research papers don't contribute all that much to the impact factor. Collectively they do, because there are lots of them, but individual papers do not. So a review paper will always gather more citations than an original research paper. It's very rare for review papers not to be cited, but there are always original research papers that are never cited. And that counts for, that applies to nurse education and practice or to Nature. There's always a tail of papers that are not cited. Only 15% of the papers really contribute towards the impact factor. And this is just to illustrate this. This is the most cited articles in the last period. And you can see within that, the second and third most cited papers were review papers. There are other papers there too, but they contribute together far more citations than the other papers. Then all-time articles in my journal, the only pattern there you can see are review papers. The top cited is a review, second, and then the sixth article. But it's the only pattern you can see. You can't see any other sort of pattern in the papers, but review papers always show up like this. Likewise, most downloaded articles are also review papers. So it applies to downloads, it applies to citations, and as I say, it's one of the only patterns that you can see in publishing. So just to re-emphasize, as editors and publishers, we're very keen on review papers. So in my journal, what gets published? Well, we do publish editorials, we publish review papers, we publish original research papers, and we also, for the time being, publish discussion papers. So discussion papers are not quite as rigorous as review papers, but they raise interesting issues in a scholarly way within nurse education and practice. But other types of journals publish other types of papers, so do check to see what a journal actually publishes. Sometimes you cannot fit your manuscript into a particular journal. Do check the aims and scope, which will be within the guidance. This tells you what the mission of the journal is, what it's trying to achieve and how you can help it, what it publishes, the kind of papers, as I've just shown you, the nature of the articles published, in other words, peer-reviewed. Usually we want them to address an international audience. We don't want them to be too local, and we want them to be scholarly and to follow various parts of the guidance. And also who is the intended readership. Is it wide? Is it clinical? Is it educational? Is it for other researchers? So you can begin to get an idea from the aims and scope of what a journal is trying to do. And also, as part of the guidance, the aims and scope of a journal are also regularly updated. I updated mine in this journal when I joined, and we update the guidance to try and improve the kind of articles that we're getting into the journal. Right, so that's everything I want to say about the impact factor. I want to just look very briefly at the peer review process. If you're lucky to get your paper through to an editor and the editor is happy to accept it, then the paper will be sent out for peer review. And peer review is often seen as as something like a battle, a combative process, but it's not meant to be like that. The peer review process is meant to be cooperative, and it's meant to help you as an author publish the best possible paper that you can publish. And when it goes out to an audience, that it will be read, it will be useful, and it will be cited. Now, the peer review process is far from perfect, and it's often questioned, and it is not perfect, but it's probably the best system that we have. But there are different models developing of peer review. I'm going to talk here about the more traditional models. So as I say, it's meant to be a circular and a helpful process for authors, and it helps the author to publish good papers. It helps the publication to maintain its reputation and to be accountable to the scholarly community. There are essentially two types of peer review, and people here I know listening are from different fields, so you may have different models in your field, but within my field, within health and psychology and many other fields, double-blind peer review is the most normal way of doing things. In other words, it's double-blinded. Those of you who do clinical trials will understand what I mean by that. It's double-blinded in the sense that the author doesn't know who the reviewer is, and the reviewer doesn't know who the author is. And normally, certainly for Clarivate journals, there has to be more than one reviewer. You cannot publish within Clarivate and have an impact factor with fewer than 2 reviewers. So that is a very common system, and it's been prevalent in my field up until now. But there are journals like the BMC journals and some other journals in the laboratory sciences, and increasingly in other fields, including my own, that operate open peer review. This was very much anathema. It was frowned upon at one time, but we normally give people the option of whether they want to be identified as reviewers. And it's becoming very common in articles that I review from a variety of journals for me to know who the authors are. So there are advantages and disadvantages of this kind of peer review. I don't have time to discuss that just now. You can ask me questions if you want about it, but just be aware when you are submitting the kind of peer review that's operating in that journal. And just as a footnote, there are other types of review developing by the use of preprinting, which again, I don't have time to go into that today, but people are putting up preprints and getting reviews on them from other people before the paper, well, after the paper is published, but before it's actually sent to a journal. So the peer review system is evolving and developing. Peer review is not perfect. It can only look for obvious errors, unacceptable practices, things that are unethical. It can look for repetition of previously published work, in other words, ethical problems, which I will come to at the end of the session. And also, if the contributions the paper make are not very significant, that can be pointed out by the peer reviewers. And just to demonstrate to you what the peer review process is like, this is the landing page for the editors of my previous journal. And this is an article that was sent out for 3 reviews, and the 3 reviews all came back differently. One said revision, one said accept, and one said reject. So as you can see, it's not perfect, and it's not even very reliable. However, those decisions by the reviewers help the editor to come to a decision, and it's the editors who make the decision, not the peer reviewers. I don't know what the decision by the editor was in this case, but it's not uncommon to see this kind of thing. So this is just, peer review is just about somebody else offering a view, really. It's not a scientific process. Right, I said that I would talk briefly about the Equator Network, and the Equator Network, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, is about enhancing the quality and transparency of health research. Equator is concerned not so much with the way research is conducted, although it's part of that. It's all about how research is reported. And I'm not going to go into all of the Equator guidelines. If you have not been on the Equator Network, please take some time to check it, because there were only a handful of guidelines there a few years ago. Now it's huge. There are lots of guidelines, and there's almost no kind of paper or study that doesn't have relevant reporting guidelines. So there are guidelines there for quantitative papers, for case control, for qualitative, for all sorts of papers. What I'm going to do is give you two examples of the guidance that is the main part of Equator, the initial parts of Equator, and the most commonly used. So first of all, I want to talk about the consort guidance and the consort statement. And again, those of you who are clinical trialists will know about this. The consort checklist is about the transparent reporting of clinical trials, of randomized trials. And there are two important aspects here, the consort checklist and the consort flow diagram. And if you are submitting a clinical trial or any kind of trial, or even an educational trial, but something that divides people into control group and treatment groups, then you must use the consort guidance. And the editorial assistant at the beginning of the process will look to see what kind of article you've submitted, and if it claims to be a trial, they will check that you've got the consort checklist and the consort flow diagram. If you don't, the paper will be returned to you. And it's very easy to check those things. Now, I'm not going to go into the consort checklist in detail here. It's got 25 items on it, but I'm going to mention one of the items from that in just a minute. But the consort flow diagram is something that will be very familiar to most of you. It's you've got to use this to account for every person who could have been in your study and who ended up completing the study, and it allows you to do what's called intention to treat analysis. And that's very much favored by most journals. But before I move on to the next aspect, I want to talk about something that's becoming very important, and this only applies to clinical trials, not to educational trials, but I'm speaking here to a wide audience. Clinical trials should be registered, and there's an international campaign that began in the UK, but all the major publishers and therefore all the major journals are signed up to this, whereby if you are submitting and conducting a clinical trial, you must be able to prove that it's been registered in advance, that the protocol is registered and that the primary outcomes from the study are registered. And that the link to that registration must be provided along with your article so that the editor can check it, and subsequently when the paper is published, the readers can check it. So it's very important. And I think there is a clinical trials registration site in Iran, but the most commonly used one is the one in the United States, clinicaltrials.gov. Your university or your hospital has to be registered with this group. You can't just use it by yourself. There's also a Chinese clinical trial registry. There are registries in South Asia, in India, and in Europe. And I don't think there's any limit to the ones that you can use, but it's probably best to use one that's near you and in your own language. But they have to be accessible in English too. So that's becoming very important, and it's becoming something which journals are auditing and being judged on. Next, I want to talk after consort about Prisma guidance. And again, those of you who are systematic reviewers will understand that Prisma is about the transparent reporting of systematic reviews and meta-analysis. And again, there's a checklist and a flow diagram. The diagram, the web page looks very similar. It's the same organization that produces these. And you can see there that it also mentions that it's part of the Equator Network. And the key things here, the checklist, which I won't go into, it's part of Equator, will be something that's familiar to those of you who've either read or carried out systematic reviews. It's a flow diagram, similar idea to the consort flow diagram. This is the way in which you explain all of the papers that you found, how you decided to remove the duplicates or exclude other records down to the papers that you actually qualitatively looked at or meta-analyzed. So every article must be accounted for. It's very important that you check the arithmetic because if you miss any out, then it will be sent back for revision. Okay, that's everything I want to say about the Equator guidance. And what I want to talk about now for the remainder of the session, probably for another maybe 20 minutes or so, if that's okay, before we take some questions, is about publication ethics. This group called COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, exists, as it says, to promote integrity in research publication. It was initially a medical journal initiative. Again, it's from the UK, but it is definitely international. All the major publishers support COPE, and therefore all the major journals in most fields, perhaps not in the humanities, but science, medicine, psychology, nursing, other allied health professions, all adhere to COPE guidance. So there's a web page which you can check, and if you've not had the opportunity to look at the COPE webpage before, I would strongly urge you. It is multilingual. I'm not sure if it's available in everyone's language who's listening, but of course it's also available in English. But there are translations for some countries. And it contains a great deal of useful information, which I will leave you to explore. So, why do we need publication ethics? Well, publication ethics exists, as it says here, from Biomed Central to ensure high quality scientific publications, publications that the public can trust and that people receive credit for their ideas. So there are several aspects to publication ethics. It's not just about making sure that you do not publish the wrong thing that's unethical. It's also about making sure that people understand that there's an ethical framework, but it's also about making sure that the right people get credit for their ideas. I will come back to that point at the end. And I really like this quote here. It's a adapted quote from somebody called Aldo Leopold. Ethical behavior is doing the right thing when no one else is watching. So publication ethics, as described by COPE and implemented by journals and editors and publishers, is not a policing system. It's not there to look over your shoulder all the time. It's there to tell you how to do the right thing. We expect you to do the right thing, but also to tell you that if you don't do the right thing and you are subsequently found to not have done it and you're investigated, then there will be consequences, and those consequences can be very serious. Now, before I proceed, I just want to assure you that as an editor-in-chief, inform you that it's not uncommon to be dealing with ethical issues. There's always something there. There's always some dispute between authors or somebody being reported. So this is not something that's rare. It's actually quite common. It's becoming more frequent because there are more guidance. People are more aware of ethical issues. And of course, we now have articles online. It's easier to find when things have been done wrongly. And we also have similarity checkers to see how similar articles are to other articles. So we've many tools in the trade to make sure that we stop unethical papers being published, and if they are, that we then subsequently deal with them. So why do ethical issues arise? Well, journals exist at the highest level to enhance the scientific database, of course, but of course they also enhance seniority and income of individuals. They enhance, in the medical field, they definitely enhance pharmaceutical company profits, and of course they enhance the profits of publishers. So wherever you get the possibility for someone to be advantaged by doing the wrong thing, some people will do the wrong thing. Some people will publish plagiarized papers or the wrong papers or something that somebody else has done, or they'll make something up to make their CV look better, to be promoted and get more pay. Pharmaceutical companies will put pressure on people to obviously to exaggerate the effects in their trials, or to ignore the trials that are not showing the what they want them to show. That's part of registration. And of course, publishers and indeed editors are often looking for papers that seem to be sensational, or something that's likely to be highly cited, even if it's not necessarily correct. And I have to say that during the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been a great deal of dispute over articles published in relation to COVID, many of them claiming miracle cures or what, whatever, various treatments for COVID have been promoted from around the world, seemingly with evidence, but when it's looked into, these papers are inaccurate, and there's been a great deal of disputes and great many withdrawn papers. So there's always pressure for people to do the wrong thing. So, as I say, the COPE web page tells you how to, it provides you with resources, and it tells you how we deal with ethical issues. So what are the ethical issues in publication? Turning the clock, if you turn the clock back about 10 or 15 years, there would have only been one or two ethical issues, but they've grown, and they're quite specific and quite different. And I want to, in the final minutes of the lecture, just be quite clear with you what these are and how to avoid them. So I'll go through them one by one. But the list includes duplication, which I'll come back to, plagiarism, which I will come back to, falsification and fabrication, which are slightly different things, authorship, which is a very important issue and one of the most common causes of dispute, and finally, conflicts of interest. So I will go through each of these one at a time. And the reason I'm trying to share this with you is that if you get these things right in your articles on submission and no questions are raised, that's going to help you to get published, but it also makes sure that you don't publish things that are false or fabricated or plagiarized, because these can have serious consequences on your career. So duplication, basically down at the bottom right, you've got a meat being sliced up thinly. Basically, that's part of the duplication. But essentially, you're not allowed to republish the same findings again. You shouldn't do this. You're not allowed to submit the same manuscript to 2 or more journals at once. I'm often asked this question, but you're not allowed to do that. You should do them one at a time, and you have to sign an agreement that you're only submitting it to that journal. And you shouldn't divide research projects into too many little papers. That's called salami slicing. That's a salami down in the picture at the right. So, oh, sorry, I'll go back. So I'll go through this again. So when I say not republishing the same findings, you are allowed on occasions to publish the same findings in different languages. So those of you who are writing not as English first language writers, may have journals in your own country, you can republish those findings in English, but you have to get the agreement of both journals to do that. And you have to make sure that you've got that agreement before you do it. So that there's been a slight relaxation there. This is to avoid jamming up the review system by not submitting to more than one journal at once. Those things are quite clear, but salami slicing is not exactly clear. but you've got to be careful not to do it. So for example, if you got a 3-year project and you publish 1 paper from it, that wouldn't be enough. That would be too little. That would be not giving the public a good return on its money. But if you publish 20 papers, then that might be seen as being too much. So salami slicing is really about making sure that every manuscript, every article, every part of the study stands alone. And that requires some academic judgment. If you're in doubt, ask an editor before you submit a paper. That's one of the best ways to get guidance. So that's duplication. And if you duplicate, it can be very serious. And this is from my previous journal, a retraction on the basis of duplication. I'm not going to read out all the details here, but suffice to say that the papers are retracted, but they stay in the journal with a retraction notice. And I just wanted to point out to you that the person involved in this particular retraction here, sorry, my telephone's ringing here. I'll just turn that off. The person involved in this retraction did, in fact, lose their job. So it can be very serious. And the wording here that we use is the retraction's been agreed due to duplicate publication of the same article in 2 journals. Then there's plagiarism. It's got, control and copy and control and paste at the bottom. In other words, you can't just take other people's work and use it as your own, but it does happen frequently. So basically, plagiarism is the unreferenced use of others' published and unpublished ideas. And it doesn't just apply to academic publications. It applies to any process, any part of the process. So you can't, and so you shouldn't take another person's paper and submit it under your name, even in a different language. You can't do that. And sorry, I've jumped on again by mistake. Just to be aware that plagiarism can happen at any part of the research process, not just publication. So if somebody steals your research ideas, then that's plagiarism. If a reviewer rejects your article and then goes and does that study themselves, that's also plagiarism. So it's quite wide, and it's not difficult to define or to detect, really. So you've got to be very careful. One of the ways that you can protect yourself against plagiarism or being plagiarized is publishing pre-printed papers, if the journals allow it. Put them up there as soon as you've done your study, before it's gone out to be refereed or whatever. So then people know it's your paper. So there are ways of protecting yourself against plagiarism. And again, a retraction on the basis of plagiarism. You can see that the paper's got a retraction watermark through it. It stays in the public domain. And it says here the wording that we use is retraction's been agreed due to overlap with other previously published material written by third parties. The word plagiarism is never used because it has legal consequences. Now, there's a process through which journals go to establish plagiarism, duplication, and other aspects of ethical malpractice. I won't go into those in detail. We don't have time, but you can check those on the COPE website. But essentially, we use algorithms to make sure that we're doing the right thing at each stage, and every journal that's signed up to COPE will use exactly the same processes. So next we have falsification, and falsification is basically manipulating research materials, equipment, processes, changing or omitting data so that the research isn't accurately reported. And in fact, always the research is made to look better than it is. So people will exaggerate the research. So you can miss out or not take into account outliers. That's one way of doing it. Or you can split databases up or not report that there were people missing from the data, exaggerate your return rate, for example. So there's ignoring outliers, not admitting that some data are missing, post hoc analysis that are not admitted. That's what clinical trial registration is about. You've got to specify your secondary outcomes. So all of these things are falsification, and also not including data on side effects in a clinical trial. That's a very important and very serious falsification of data. Probably more serious. I mean, they're both very serious charges, but fabrication. And fabrication is essentially making up results and then recording or reporting them. So you don't actually do the research, you just make it up and generate a database, analyze it. And people are usually caught fabricating because the data look too good to be true. And if things look too good to be true, they usually are. Another form of fabrication, which is called a minor form, is where people add in references to give their own arguments the appearance of being more important than they are. And I have actually, just before I left my previous journal, I did actually deal with a case of fabricated references. And indeed, most of the references in the paper, they weren't inappropriate, they didn't exist. And it took a very, very sharp editor on another journal to notice this. And so it's actually very difficult to detect, but very serious. And it took a long time to convince the authors that they'd done something wrong. Now, I'm going to talk for a few minutes about authorship and then finish up on conflict of interest. But this graph here, it's one produced by Cope, in fact, shows you that the various types of ethical malpractice go up and down over the years. But note how authorship at the beginning is always there. It hovers between 20 to 25%. It's always there. It's a very common problem. It's one of the first ones I ever encountered, and there's always issues to do with authorship. We deal with the other ones. We've got better at dealing with the other ones over the years, but this one we seem not to be able to convey to people. And so what I want to do is use the ICMJE guidance, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors guidance, and I want to look here at who can be an author, and I also want to use some of their guidance on conflicts of interest. So again, these are pages that you can check if you want to, and you will find the same information there. I'll just expand on them slightly here. So basically, who can be an author? Basically, it should be the people who meet the following criteria. First, you must have made a substantial contribution to conception and design or acquisition of data or analysis and interpretation. So an author for a paper doesn't have to have done all of these things. They have to have done at least one of them. And the judgment of substantial is difficult, and it's up to the research team to decide that. That cannot be decided by an editor. But everyone must have been involved in drafting the manuscript and revising it, for intellectual content, not just editing the manuscript. And everyone must give final approval of the version that's sent out to be published. One author shouldn't be doing this without consulting the others. So if anything goes wrong afterwards, everybody should be able to take responsibility for anything that's pointed out as being wrong. And then the fourth point, whether or not you've done all of these things in the article, if you're asked about something that's wrong with the paper in terms of its data or its ethics, then everyone has to be willing to be part of investigating that and making sure that it's resolved properly. So these are things that you sign up to when you agree to be an author on a paper, and some journals are very specific in asking you to sign against all of these. But again, we don't police this. We expect people to be honest about it, and sometimes they're not. And finally, people who have made other contributions, technical help or writing assistance or editing, for example, they can be acknowledged on the paper with their permission. And the final bullet point is, prior to submitting an article, everybody should agree the order in which their names are listed on the manuscript. Cope say that any change after submission is an ethical issue. So if authors write to an editor to say, we'd actually like to add someone to this or take someone off or change the order of the authors, we have to stop the paper at that point until we investigate why. Changing the order of authors is not usually very serious. Adding an author is not usually too much of an issue, provided they can justify it. Removing an author would be very serious, and we would want to know if that was justified, and we'd want to know from that author who's being reviewed if they agree. So we do take this very seriously. Best practice in authorship is consult and adhere to the ICMJE guidance, which I've just given you. Discuss the order of authorship at the beginning of the project, not at the end when you're writing the papers. Document everything in writing and make sure everybody's responsible for the content. And you can use this algorithm here from the National Institutes of Health in America, and it's very good. Green means yes and purple means no, and you can check how much any author, particularly yourself, meets those criteria. I won't go through it in detail, but it's easy to find on Google on the website. If not, ask me for these PowerPoints. I can send them to you. And authorship guidelines, I'm using the British Sociological Association guidelines here. They do give some guidance on order of authors. Different fields like medicine, nursing, psychology, so forth, they do have different conventions. But I just wanted to say that as editors and publishers, we are not remotely interested in the order of authors. We're only interested that all the authors are there in whichever order you wish. So we don't give any more credence to the first author than the last author, and we're really only interested in the corresponding author with whom we can correspond. That's our point of contact with the journal. But some countries and some systems give more credence to first authorship, some to last, some to corresponding author. But as publishers and editors, we're not interested in that. But usually, order of authors is the person who's made the person who's made the major contribution to the paper or taken the lead is usually entitled to be the first author. And the other points here I've sort of covered already, and it's really the first point that I'm interested in there. Okay, finally, before we stop for some questions in a couple of minutes, I want to deal with conflicts of interest. I will do this quite quickly. Just to be aware that a conflict of interest, using Taylor and Francis' definition, can occur when you've got a financial, commercial, legal, or professional relationship with other organizations or people working in them. Essentially anything that could influence your research or the decisions that you make around your research. Now, conflicts of interest are not wrong as such. They have to be declared. That's the important point. So for example, if you do have a conflict of interest, then don't try to hide it, declare it, and that's fine, as long as everybody can look at your research and make a judgment in that light. For example, if you're doing a clinical trial of a drug and that clinical trial is funded by the drug company who make the drug, there's a clear conflict of interest there. A financial conflict of interest in that your research is being funded, and the possibility that pressure may be put on you to present your results in a particular way. Now, as long as everybody knows that you have that relationship, then you're less likely to do these things. The issue is that if you're found out afterwards to have had a conflict of interest, that can be very serious. So there are endless examples of conflicts of interest, but financial relationships, as I've just said, having your research paid for or being paid by an institution, personal relationships with people, you may be related to someone in a company that's funding your research, that needs to be declared. Professional relationships, for example, visiting professorships and honorary professorships, these should always be declared. Political affiliations, you would rarely need to declare your political affiliations, but there are some issues which are not neutral. I can only give you an example from my own country of the recent decision by my country to leave the European Union. So people writing about European matters, if they've been involved in an organization which is either for or against the European Union, I think that should be declared as well. And religious affiliations as well. Religious and moral matters are not neutral. Examples would include things like abortion and evolution. So, you know, if your religious affiliations are likely to have altered your interpretation, then that's another potential conflict of interest. But these, we could sit here for the rest of the day speaking about conflicts of interest. There are just so many of them. Basically, you've got to think, is there anything about me or what I've done that might give an impression that your research or your decisions are biased? And that includes me as an editor as well. So for example, if I am submitting an article to my own journal, I have to declare that I'm the editor-in-chief. If I'm taking a paper that's been submitted by a university where I'm a visiting professor, I have to declare that too. So I'm going to end after this PowerPoint. I just wanted to draw your attention to a very good resource. It's called Nurse, Author and Editor, but don't worry, those of you who are not nurses, it just happens to be produced by a nursing organization, the International Academy of Nursing Editors, edited by a very good friend of mine, Leslie Nichol, and I write frequently for this. And it's about how to get published. It's about how to write an introduction, how to write a discussion, how to write an abstract, explaining publication metrics, for example. There are lots of articles here, and the great thing about this is it's completely free. So Google Nurse, Author and Editor, and you will have immediate access to everything here. You can also sign up for alerts if you want to, but it's an excellent resource, and I would really point you towards this, whether or not you're from a nursing background or not. And finally, with a few minutes to go, that's my email address. You're welcome to email me afterwards if you have any questions that you're too shy or you don't have time to ask at the moment. If you're interested in my research and scholarship, you can check my ORCID number. Not everyone will have access to Twitter, I guess, but I'm on Twitter. Anybody who's got access to WeChat, I'm also on WeChat, and you can find me there very easily too. But mainly I wanted to show you my email address so that if you want to keep in contact with me, you're more than welcome. Now I'm going to finish there, get rid of these PowerPoints and try to stop sharing. Stop sharing, that's it. Okay. So if anybody has, oh, I see 73 points in the chat. I don't know if they're all questions. I don't know if I can deal with all of those, but let me scroll up and have a look at these and see where the questions start. Okay, hi Ahmad. Well, the questions are quite far down.
Thank you very much, Roger, for your nice information and your nice presentation. I think there's a lot of questions about each of them, and it needs another meetings in later.
Okay.
Okay, everyone. Everyone has any question?
Yeah.
Please.
Well, I see questions on the chat here, Ahmad. Maybe I could run down these for a few minutes. I can see the questions here. For example, the first question, I think, is from Fatima Gardashi, who says, is it possible to write two separate articles from a large research project with one code of ethics? That is the same code of ethics in two articles resulting. Yeah. I'm not sure I completely understand what you mean about code of ethics. Do you mean whether you mean ethical approval for the study? But what I would say is it's absolutely perfectly possible to write more than one paper from any study. That's not a problem, provided the papers are discrete and different, so that they're not overlapping. So that isn't a problem at all, as long as they're not the same paper.
Okay. Could you please open your video, Roger?
Oh, it is, yeah, it is. I'm there. That's it closed and that's it open. Can you not see me?
Your video, no, I don't see.
All right, maybe I'm further along in your view. I'm next to you in my view.
Okay.
It's difficult. Okay. There are so many people on it. So, yeah, my video is definitely working. Anyway, there's no great advantage to seeing me anyway.
No problem. No. Okay. If there is any question, please.
Yeah.
Okay.
Somebody's asked, I'm interested in areas such as manuscript editing and proofreading. If interested to collaborate in writing in the area, please kindly email me. I guess that's for other colleagues in the chat and not necessarily for me.
Participants can open their microphone to ask you any question.
Yeah, they're welcome to.
Okay. Everything was clear for them.
Yeah. Someone's asking here if they can have the slides. They're welcome to. And what I will do is I will try to upload the slides here so they can get them if they want to. It's there. It's called Iran, the publication process. That should go through to you. Well, there aren't quite so many questions here, Ahmad, because it's mostly comments. But here's one important cause of rejection of the RCT article in Impact Factor Journal is the lack or absence of RCT registration number. Yeah, what's your recommendation for researchers that their country doesn't have a clinical trial registry? You can register your research in other clinical trial registries, as far as I know. I mean, I don't know which country the question comes from. It's from Safia Sabri Piro, so I don't know where that's from. But it's very rarely the case that you will not find a registration system somewhere in your area, and you have to, because you will not get your RCT published without registration, and it should be registered before you start. So I don't know specifically how to answer your question, but you do have to try hard to find a registry.
Okay.
Somebody says they can't download the slides by phone. That's okay. You can email me, or the organizers can send them out to people afterwards if they want.
Everyone can download your slides here, yes?
Yeah, they're all there. Yeah.
Yes. It's uploaded.
Yeah, but some people won't be able to get them because they're only on their phone. Somebody's asking if they want to know if getting free samples from companies is considered a conflict of interest. It would be if you're doing research for them, yes. And I think that would be something that you need to declare. You don't have to be frightened of conflicts of interest. You just need to make sure that you make sure that the editors and the readers know.
Okay.
Very quiet people. Okay, if the journal requires word limits, can we send the checklist or tables as supplementary materials to reach the? You have to check. You have to check what the journal says, but usually sending things in as an appendix doesn't count in the word count, and sometimes putting things in tables doesn't. But some journals, usually North American journals, normally include tables in the word count. Most European journals don't, so you just need to check the guidance for the particular journal.
Okay.
If we get some mineral from a company for CRT, is it a conflict of interest? It could be if the research is being done for them, but if it's not being done for them, I don't think that's a problem. I don't think that's a problem. It just depends. You've got to judge whether what you're getting is likely to make your decisions any different.
Okay.
If the journal indexing in Scopus at the time, somebody's asking here about Scopus, and if the journal's indexed at the time of submission, but then it's excluded later, can we submit the article to some other journal? You can do, but not if it's already been published, I'm afraid. If it's been published, I'm afraid you can't do that. But if you notice this in the process of having the article reviewed, there's nothing to stop you from withdrawing the article from the journal. You can do that yourself. Make it absolutely clear that you want to have the article withdrawn. Keep evidence that you've written to the editor and evidence that they've replied to you. Then you could submit somewhere else. but if it's been published, I'm afraid not. You can't do that. Yeah, fee is very high for some impact journal, and sometimes the journals send reject. Well, you shouldn't have to pay any, this is Dr. Kareem, you shouldn't have to pay any money with a reputable journal prior to submitting it. If you do, then that is a predatory journal and we're trying to clamp down on them. So journals should not take money in the process of submission. So you've got to be very careful that you're not submitting to bad journals, essentially, something I didn't have much time to talk about. So I'm sorry that that's happened.
Roger,
Yes.
journals get money after it's accepted, yes?
Not all. Yeah. If the journal is an open access journal, one that is free to look at as a reader, then you will most likely have to pay to make it open access because it's seen as being an advantage to you. But if it's a library journal that's a subscription journal, then the journal shouldn't be taking money from the author for that. It's complicated, but you shouldn't be taking money for those things. So you shouldn't have to pay. But there are various models now. For example, the journal I edit now is a subscription journal, but you can pay to make your article open access. So there are two systems working at once. But most articles are published at no charge to the author.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, dear Professor, sometimes the journal sent to us rejected without any explanation.
Yeah.
There should be explain the causes of rejected.
Yeah.
So why?
Okay, Dr. Kareem.
Your interpretation for that. Thank you.
Yeah, fine, thanks. Well, I'll tell you why, and I'm guilty of this myself. If we reject a paper at the desk stage, at the beginning of the process, you know, we may have 40 or 50 papers in a week, maybe more. And what we're trying to do at that stage is prioritize the ones we want to put through and get the other ones back to you as quickly as we can. So we don't take time to give an explanation. We simply don't have time then. So we just send it back to you in the hope that we will enable you at least to get it off somewhere more quickly. So most journals will not give you an explanation at the beginning of the process if they reject it, because they will often be rejecting it on the basis that the title isn't attractive. It's not something that they want to publish. It's outside the scope of the journal. We'll always tell you that because there's a specific button to press for that. But if we just don't like the study or we don't feel it's going to get through, we don't give you any details. So all I can do is apologize for that, but that's pretty universal across the publishing industry. However, if the paper goes down into the reviewing process, then you should always get an explanation if it's rejected at that point. So that's all I can say, Dr. Kareem. It's an unfortunate consequence of the number of articles that we're receiving these days. The volume just goes up, and we have to find a way of managing it quickly.
Thank you.
Not satisfactory, but hold on. Somebody's asked, is it possible to write 2 articles from a large research project with 1 code of ethics? Yes, Fatima, I think I've answered this question already. Yes, it is. There's no problem with that, provided they are separate papers. You can even use papers with the same methods in them as long as the results are different. But you should always tell the journal that you're publishing more than 1 paper from a particular study. Then someone's asking which conflicts of interest are necessary in an RCT. Well, none if there aren't any. But if the research is funded by a drug company and you're doing testing that drug, then definitely. And any other sort of relationships. So if you are working at another university as a visiting professor or something like that, then and you're working with people there, those relationships all need to be declared. So there's nothing specific to an RCT, but it's, you know, you just have to have a look at have a look at the ICMG guidance and think, do I meet one of these conflicts of interest? So there's nothing specific.
Okay.
Um,
You have 3 minutes for finish
okay.
the meeting.
Okay. Well, there's not another question there about salami slicing and the code of ethics. I mean, it's the same thing. As long as the papers are not too overlapping, then you're okay. And if you're in any doubt, ask the editors before you submit.
Thank you, Roger, for your informative information that you present, like always, and like last meeting with Rehabilitation School. It was very nice presentation, and I hope we can continue our webinars in later future. And everyone, if you have any question, we have the last question.
Are free journals more prestigious than others is the final question. Not necessarily. There are some very good open access journals now, such as Biomed Central and PLOS One, which are very prestigious, but they're not free. So it's not really a distinction. Having said that, some of the journals that are not free are very poor and very unprestigious. So you've got to be very, very careful. Maybe I could come back and give a talk about predatory publishing and open access at some point, because it's important. Well, I'm really grateful. Ahmad set this up. I'm very grateful for your help, Ahmad, in setting this up, and to the team who did the technical side today and overcame my technical problems. And thank you very much for nearly 90 people attending and listening. I'm very grateful. And as I say, don't hesitate to contact me if you've got any questions.
Sorry for the late and any problem with the technical. I hope everyone is good, and thank you very much, Roger.
Okay.
If you have any last message for participants.
All right. My last message would be something I said right at the beginning. Make every rejection the beginning of the next submission. Don't stop. If you get rejected, just put it somewhere else and make sure you don't stop until you get published. That's the main point.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
I'm going to go now. I'm sure I'll be in contact soon with you, Ahmad, and everyone else. Nice to see you.
Nice
Bye-bye.
to see you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.